Putin, he basically said Ukraine was all the fault of the communists, that Lenin and then Stalin and then Khrushchev, by creating, in his terms, creating Ukraine, which he claimed didn't exist before, really created the current situation. And it's worth remembering that actually the communists have become a bit of a problem for Putin in the recent period. I mean, they did quite well in the last elections. Their vote went up significantly. And between them and the ultra-nationalists and maybe the liberals that we hear so much in the in the American press, but he's facing political problems at home, and his plank is, I'm the one who stands up for Russia. I'm the strong man. I think all foreign policy is about domestic politics. I always believe that, and I certainly argue that in my book. And I think that's, a lot of, if you understand what brought Putin to this present position, comes from his position at home, which he felt had to do.
Yeah, I mean, let's dive a bit more into your book then and past current events, while still, I think, connecting it to it, because you talk about sanctions in your book. And I think there's very little literacy in the United States about what sanctions entail and what the breadth of what they can cause, right? You can do something that's a bit more targeted, like Biden is doing right now. Is that effective enough? Or you can do very broad ones that end up really, really hurting the people of the country as opposed to the leadership and they basically pass it off to them. Talk a little bit about the role of sanctions in American foreign policy in particular over the past century or so, and how that's a bit of a that's sort of a military effort, while also not having the oversight of one. Not that it has that much oversight, but if you could talk a bit about that.
Sure. Well, you called it right. It is, but I mean, it is our principal sort of offensive instrument. I mean, akin to an instrument of war, to which we've become increasingly addicted for various reasons. I mean, reviewing it quickly. I date them back to modern era. You date them back to Cuba in 1960, or 61, when Kennedy imposed sanctions. And I think we've just had some documents released giving the original sort of policy argument for doing them, which was to produce hunger and desperation among the Cuban people, leading to the overthrow of the regime. And, for a while they did broad-based sanctions. That really changed. In the late 1980s, there was a whole new sort of view from inside the sanctions bureaucracy. They thought of ways to make them targeted. Originally, it was in connection with the war on drugs, to use them, like it's almost the same language as the whole drone warfare approach, precision strikes against high-value targets. And in fact, to me, it seems like the same mentality. By taking out key people, you can achieve your objective. And the lesson, obviously, from then till now is it doesn't do anything of the kind, both with drones, as a matter of fact, and with targeted sanctions. In that, you target some banker or a trade official, whoever, the specially designated, the SDN list, specially designated national list, is thousands and thousands of names long now. You can look it up on the Treasury website. But I've seen no sign I cannot find a case where it's actually, achieved the stated objective. So not on the war on drugs. We have as many drugs coming in as ever. Not in terms of, destroying the Syrian regime. And I can guarantee you not in terms of bringing down Putin.
Well, I mean, is there a difference, in your opinion, in sanctions levied against a large and wealthy nation like Putin that does have resources, as opposed to, say, the draconian sanctions against Saddam Hussein, for example, and nations like Iraq, or even like Cuba, where the United States can kind of flex its muscle to a degree?
Yes, absolutely. It's a good question. we were able to embargo, have very cruel, harsh sanctions against Iraq for 12 years. With on the correct assumption, it didn't really make much difference to us. I mean, it kept up the price of oil a bit, probably, which was fine by the oil companies and all the people they pay off here in Washington. Otherwise, it didn't make much difference. The difference, I think, of sanctioning Russia is, obviously, as we've been hearing a lot about in recent weeks, Europe depends on Russia to keep warm. I mean, for its 40% of its gas comes from hugely dependent on energy for Russia. It'll put up the price of oil for everyone, for you and me and everyone else in the world, quite sharply. I mean, not many people realize that at the moment, Russia is our second largest source of foreign oil. It'll put up the price of grain. Russia is a huge grain exporter, supplying, for example, wheat to Egypt to make the bread in Egypt. So that's a sort of staple of the Egyptian diet. So when the price of bread goes up in Egypt, you tend to have riots, and I confidently expect that's what will be happening. The huge amounts of very important commodities come from Russia. So titanium, for example, for the U.S. aircraft industry. So in a way, by sanctioning something like Russia, as you said, to a certain degree, we're sanctioning ourselves, and that's the problem with this kind of weapon. It's the other point about sanctions is they're sticky. They're very hard to take off. Easy to impose, stroke of the pen. The Treasury, OFAC, Office of Foreign Assets Control, very powerful bureaucracy, issues its orders. But then you say, okay, no, it's fine. We sort of forgive you now, and we're not having the sanctions anymore. But because of the way they operate, it doesn't have it. Removing them doesn't have any effect. That's why the Iranian deal, why the Iranians are so reluctant to sign up again, because they said last time you promised to lift sanctions and they didn't really go away. That's what's happening very tragically, and unfortunately, it's going to vanish from the news now because of what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in Afghanistan. We're still sanctioning Afghanistan. And the Treasury says, oh, no, we issued special licenses so that, you can send humanitarian goods. But it doesn't work because the banks won't handle, the banking system in Afghanistan's broken down because of our sanctions. And foreign banks won't handle transactions to Afghanistan.
And they have an issue of just not having enough currency in the nation, and so
it's sanctioned. It's printed in Poland or somewhere, and and it's sanctioned. So it's a horrible weapon. Sanctions, I think, because its consequences are so badly sort of whimsically. Well, they're so whimsically applied, and their consequences are very badly understood.
And proportional to the nation's wealth and power, I would imagine, as well. You can see what's happening in Afghanistan versus what you talk about is going to likely be the consequences of these sanctions against Russia. Although my other question to you, and not to focus too much on this, is just on everybody's mind. I want to talk more about your book as well. But what is your sense of what can be done outside of sanctions? Because I'm no one here and is in favor of military response from the United States.
Well, that's a very difficult question.
Yeah.
I think the obloquy that's being showered on Russia quite rightly now on Putin for doing this, has to be sustained. We cannot be understanding of this. I think what will happen is, he's been clearly determined to destroy as much of Ukraine's military potential as possible. You see he's attacking all these various airfields, like the airfield outside of Kiev, ports along the Black Sea that he claimed were going to be getting ready for the use by NATO forces. I don't know, maybe. I think in the end, what he'll hold on to will be the, again, this is not an original thought, the entire provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk, which is what they've been claiming all along, which they only held part of. and then is settled back. That has the advantage for him, which, as far as I understand it, that makes it impossible for Ukraine to join NATO, because I think it's in the NATO, whatever it is, charter, that you can't join if you've got an ongoing dispute with a neighbor, which Ukraine certainly has, on dispute, which we'll have with that encroachment on Ukrainian territory. So what is to be done? I think I don't think we should at least not make it worse. I don't think these huge I think these huge sanctions are going to have bad knock-on effects. As I said, I don't think we should sort of go further. I think we should, maybe the best thing to do is, it sounds horrible to say it, is nothing.
Refugee assistance.
Of course,
Yes.
But the effects are really incalculable now. The refugees pouring into Europe. I mean, the last time, and there's talk of letting Ukraine join the EU. I doubt that's going to happen, but the very possibility of Turkey joining the EU gave us Brexit. So quite clearly, so the thought of millions of Turks and Middle Eastern refugees pouring into Europe is, maybe they'd be more benign towards Ukrainians, but I still think it would arise very dangerous reactions.